Good morning, everybody. Today is a special day because today is going to be the beginning of our next reading unit. And this reading unit is a unit that explores the genre of fantasy. And this will be a new adventure for us. I want to start off by showing you the trailer of a recent movie that came out called Onward. And what I want you to pay attention to are all the fantasy elements in this movie, from the characters to the setting to some of the events. So I'm going to go ahead and play that trailer now and watch closely for all the elements of fantasy. And just give it a minute. It's loading.
I'm a mighty warrior!
Morning, Mom!
Hey, birthday boy.
By the laws of yore, I must dub thee a man today. Kneel before me.
That's okay.
I have a gift from your dad. He just said to give you this when you were both over 16.
No way! It's a wizard staff. Dad was a wizard.
What? Your dad was an accountant.
This spell brings him back. For one whole day, Dad will be back.
What? Back to life? That's not possible.
It is with this.
I'm gonna meet Dad.
Whoa, Pete!
It's getting harder to hold!
Ah, he's just legs. I can barely remember Dad having a top part.
Oh, what did I do? Hi.
We only have 24 hours to bring the rest of him back.
Until then, ta-da!
Oh, that's great. Dad, you look just like I remember.
You got a problem, Shades?
If it's adventure you seek, you've come to the right tavern.
Oh, no.
Okay, so as you can see, this movie that just came out has a lot of elements of fantasy. You can see from the beginning, the characters look kind of like humans in some ways, but other ways you know that they are some sort of magical or otherworldly characters. And of course, you've got the magical elements of the father possibly being a wizard, and then the two boys trying to perform a spell to bring him back. Now, I want you to remember everything you've already learned about genres. Remember, genres come in two major categories: fiction and nonfiction. When you look at this chart, I want you to look on the left side. You can see the title fiction is broken down into two branches. The first branch is realism. Those are the books like realistic fiction or historical fiction, where things happen in the real world, but the story's made up. And then you've got the fantasy branch. That's the branch that we're going to be focusing on in this unit. This branch is broken down into traditional literature, which are like folktales and fairy tales and fables. And you focused a lot on that branch in third grade. And then on the other side of the fantasy branch is modern fantasy, which includes animal fantasy, low fantasy, high fantasy, and science fiction. We're going to be focused on that branch. And I'm going to talk more about what low fantasy and high fantasy is a little bit later. On the right side of the chart is the nonfiction major branch, informational texts. Now, we've done a unit on nonfiction earlier this year. We'll return to nonfiction at the end of your 5th grade year. But for this unit, we are fully focused on the fantasy branch, and you'll be able to have the choice to read modern fantasy, and you can also read traditional literature. This is a more zoomed in focus on the fantasy branch. This shows you that you can read from traditional literature, which includes folk tales, fairy tales, fables, legends, epics, ballads, myths. You can also read modern fantasy, and that will include some of the low and high fantasy that I'm going to talk about in a minute. Now, when you think about the traditional literature that you've read in the past, it might include titles like Cinderella, fables, some other types of folk tales like Why Mosquitoes Buzz in People's Ears, and stories like Little Red Riding Hood. Modern fantasy includes some titles like this, and many of you have read some of these titles. For example, Amulet was hugely popular in our grade level. Many of you have really gotten into the Harry Potter series this year. When you look at some of the other titles on the screen, like Warriors, Diesel, The Dragon of Cripple Creek, a lot of these titles you will find on Epic. I will give you the caveat that Amulet and Harry Potter are not on Epic, unfortunately. But all the other titles that you see on this screen are on Epic. The Sisters Grimm, Lumberjanes, Elf Realm, Tank and Fizz, and there's a lot of others. You are going to want to try to find a fantasy book that you're going to enjoy. I would recommend all of these. So what are the characteristics of fantasy? What makes a fantasy book fantasy? I'm going to go through some of these bullets. So they're going to contain unrealistic elements or otherworldly elements, things that don't exist in our world. The characters might have magical powers. They're going to go on quests. They're going to have struggles, just like us. And there may be objects like a staff or animals that have magical powers. And you will sometimes see real people in imaginary places. Kind of like Harry Potter. He began as kind of like a real person but ended up in an imaginary place. He also ended up realizing he's a wizard. There may be time travel. And there is often, almost always, a good versus evil plot. So, earlier we talked about high fantasy versus low fantasy. And this is going to be an important concept for you to wrap your head around, because high fantasy is a story that is set in an imaginary world. So, setting is the most important factor in understanding if you're reading high fantasy or low fantasy. So again, high fantasy means you are in an imaginary world. Now the story might begin in our world and then move into an imaginary world. And that's a little bit of a blend of high and low. Low fantasy means that we are in our world, but the magic elements appear in our world. Now I want to show you a little clip from Jumanji. In this movie, the characters start out in the real world. They're actually in their school. They're in the basement of their school serving detention when they discover a video game. And they decide they're going to play that video game. As they turn on the video game, the setting changes from the real world to an imaginary world. So I'm going to go ahead and play this clip. I want you to pay really close attention to how the maker of this movie changes from the real world to an imaginary world. And just give it a minute for it to load.
She's not big on fun. Okay. Fine. This might be the lamest thing I've ever done. I highly doubt that.
Welcome to Jumanji.
What's going on?
As you saw in that video clip, the characters started off in school. They were in the basement of school serving detention and decided to check out the video game and were sucked into an imaginary world. And that is exactly where the fantasy element begins. So, today is your day to find a fantasy book to read. And that's your goal. It's not an easy goal because some of you may not have read a lot of fantasy in your reading lives up to this point. But if you can read fantasy and understand it, you will be able to read many other books very well. So, let me tell you a few places you can go to find a fantasy book. First of all, Epic is a great place to find a lot of books. And Epic has a lot of fantasy books for you to choose from. You can also check out BookFlix. BookFlix has a username of OAJHome, and the password is BT Boces, BOCES. Now you can find the BookFlix password and username in the online reading resources folder on my Schoology page. The other place you can look is a place called Mac and Via, and the username and password are listed on this screen. So you can pause this video and jot that down. You can also look on your own bookshelf at home. If you have fantasy books in your house or you have other ways of getting books, then you don't have to pick from these websites, but these are here for you if you need them. Your job today is to search for a fantasy book. Now, you may not pick just one. You may have a list. You may say, you know what, I've got 2 or 3 options, and here they are. Option 1, option 2, possibly option 3. I know that sometimes when I pick a book, I don't love it, and I'm going to go to my next option. So your assignment today is to send me a book choice or maybe 2 or 3 options of fantasy books that you are going to read or at least try and eventually pick one. And I think you're going to love this unit. It's one of my favorite units. So happy book shopping. I'll talk to you guys soon.